Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Renegade Institute for Liberty webinar with Dr. Mark Goldblatt and Bryan Russell as our respondent. I'd just like to introduce the two gentlemen who will be discussing our topic for tonight. Professor Mark Goldblatt has been teaching at the Fashion Institute for Technology for the State Universities of New York since 1989. And the main subject of our talk today will be pulled from one of his recent books. I have it here with me. It's I Feel, Therefore I Am, spin off of Descartes' famous Cogito Ergo Sum. Though that is not the only thing that he has written. He has also written a number of other books, most recently, a book called Might As Well Be Dead, and looks at a very interesting situation involving a 13-year-old who's dealing with the his mom leaving. So take a look at that if you're interested in fiction that looks at these sort of core issues. And then we also have Dr. Bryan Russell. Bryan Russell is a professor here at Bakersfield College. He's been teaching here since 2015. He has distinguished himself primarily by being involved in the BC Ethics Bowl team, and he's been involved in that for quite some time now. And so I'm going to turn it over to them in just a little bit, but let me at least set the stage for what our conversation is going to be about tonight. So our conversation is going to involve material from I Feel, Therefore I Am, but I'll frame it in this way. Our culture faces a challenging moment. At the heart of it lies a question regarding epistemology. That is, the study of how we as humans know and understand things. And tonight we're going to be looking at two different ways of knowing, whose presence in our culture can be felt in almost every corner. Now, I am not a philosopher, but as a layman, I will try to set the stage as best as I can with how I understand some of the things in the issue. One way of knowing takes as a principle that the universe is an objective thing whose parts can be known, communicated, measured, and predicted. Furthermore, rational method of study conducted by any human can answer questions posed regarding the universe's nature, and any human following the exact same method would get the exact same answer. The reason is that the phenomenon they study has a definite existence and properties not dependent on an individual's unique observation. This we can broadly refer to as science. Another way of knowing takes as a principle that human beings in themselves are centers of meaning. Humans define the world around them according to their own internal beliefs without any kind of limitations. Any similarity in definitions or conclusions between individuals is the result more of a subject's environment and culture rather than a universal principle. This we can broadly refer to as subjectivism. Now, this is just me as a layman talking. Those more trained, Professor Mark Goldblatt and Professor Bryan Russell, will be able to expand, nuance, and then show you and talk about how these epistemologies can broadly affect culture. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Goldblatt, and he'll be able to talk to you for about 20 to 30 minutes, at which time we'll turn it over to Bryan Russell to respond. And then if Professor Goldblatt has anything more he'd like to say afterwards, he can do that, and then we'll open it up to question and answers. The QA module is up right now, so you should be able to ask questions whenever you have interest in doing so. And when we get to the QA time, we'll go ahead and ask those. So thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Dr. Goldblatt.
Thanks, Timothy, and I'm genuinely honored to be here. I've done probably more publicity for this book than for any of my other books, which is a little surprising in that this is not, Post Hill Press is a medium-sized independent publisher. Some of my other books have been with bigger publishers. And Post Hill has a limited PR budget. The reason this book generated so much controversy, for those of you who don't know it, is one of the interviews I did do was with Glenn Lowry's podcast with John McWhorter. They do I believe it's a bi-weekly podcast. And they had me on. John is an old friend of mine going back decades. And he had read the book and he was intent on publicizing it because he found value in it. So we did this this podcast, this webcast that Glenn does on a weekly basis, and it went up on YouTube on, I believe, a Friday. The full broadcast went up, and I got to see it for the first time. I hadn't seen it since I was taking part in it, and I was pleased with how it came out. I sat through it, the whole thing, and I thought none of us stuttered too often, and none of us said anything that we would regret. And so I was pleased. I posted a link on all my social media. And we discovered within, I believe it was within 12 hours, the video had been taken down from YouTube. And it was taken down on the grounds that it constituted hate speech. And I think all three of us were just sort of flabbergasted by that, because, it was a very civil debate. We agreed on some things, we disagreed on other things, but there was clear unanimity with regard to the subject of transgenderism, in that transgender people, whatever you think about the nature of the problem that they're wrestling with, come with a full complement of human and civil rights. And that because they come with these rights, those rights are not just should be respected, but they are guaranteed to be respected under, both the preamble to the Declaration and the First Amendment. And the point being that transgender people are entitled to live their lives in ways that they find emotionally satisfying and intellectually meaningful. That's all you can ask. And what I think got us in trouble was my saying that despite their full complements of rights, their rights do not extend to the point of asking other people or compelling other people to acknowledge as true what is demonstrably false. And I think it's that idea of demonstrably false that probably got under viewers' skin. And it caused the video to be taken down, which it turned out to be very good for my book because it generated a lot more publicity than it would have been otherwise. But it was frightening for Glenn because, he has a YouTube channel, he monetizes it, it's part of how he earns his living. And it turns out that when YouTube takes down a video, they are under no obligation to say exactly what was in your video that upset viewers. So Glenn wrote this, the full interview, if any of you go looking for it, is now on the web. It's hosted by Substack instead of by YouTube. And there are snippets of it still up on YouTube. But the entire experience was kind of disappointing, because if you can't have a civil conversation about a topic of rational inquiry, then we are at a point in our collective conversation as a nation where people are going to be drowned out by what amounts to a heckler's veto. And that's not a good state to be in. So that's the preamble to what I was going to say to begin with. So I wanted to read a couple of sections from the book, but I also didn't want to just do that. So I started out just jotting down a few points that I wanted to make. And I realized they all took the form of a paradox. So I'm just calling them paradox one, paradox two. So I'm going to read a few of those, then I'll get to the book itself, if that's okay with all of you. Okay. So paradox one comes from the title of this seminar, which references science. And my contention in talking about transgenderism specifically is that we're not really debating science. Because I don't think transgenderism is a matter of science. Science has nothing to say, affirmative or negative, about your gender identity. Your gender identity, as the term is used, has the same empirical footprint as your soul. It's not an object of rational knowledge. There's no detectable reality that corresponds to it. It's a purely speculative entity. The existence of gender identity is posited exclusively on the basis of subjective testimony from people wrestling with severe emotional distress. So the debate, as far as I can see it, is about language, logic, and power. So that's paradox number one. Paradox number two is more of a thought experiment. If I claim that despite appearances, I'm a woman, but the claim is insincere, then clearly I'm not a woman. On the other hand, according to transgender advocates, if I claim that despite appearances, I'm a woman, and the claim is sincere, then according to those activists, I am a woman. The question that raises is, can the sincerity with which a claim is made affect the truth value of the claim? Paradox number three, and this is based on something that is in the book. According to the National Human Genome Research Institute, which is a government-sponsored institute, identical twins are always the same sex because they share the same DNA profile. But if the claims of transgender advocates are true, then the NHGRI must be wrong. Identical twins are not always the same sex. Is that something we should correct on the National Human Genome Research Institute or not? Should we take that down from their website or not? Because if transgender people are what they claim to be, then the claim that identical twins are always the same sex cannot be true. Paradox number four, and this is in the form of a syllogism. If you take a traditional high school biology class, you will at one point or another be told that one characteristic of all mammals is that only the female of each species gives birth. You'll also be taught that humans are mammals. Now, there's a therefore hanging at the end of that sentence, at the end of that syllogism. Logic tells us that if each premise of a syllogism is true and the form of the syllogism is valid, then the conclusion must be true. So what's the flaw in that syllogism? Paradox number five, and the last one. And this concerns goes back again to the term gender identity. Gender identity, in quotation marks, is hard to define without using the word gender in the definition. See, for example, the World Health Organization's laughably circular attempts to define it. That being said, the condition of transgenderism according to the most frequently employed definitions, arises when the cultural roles traditionally associated with maleness and femaleness grade against the transgender person's inner sense of their, and again, it has to be there because his or her begs the question, true self. Suppose, however, that that transgender person had been raised in a very different culture, one in which the traditional roles of boys and girls and men and women were reversed. Would that person in that reversed culture still be transgender? If yes, then how would the transgender person even realize it? And if not, then gender identity must be as much a function of collective perception as individual perception. Okay, having said that, let me read a slightly altered version of the beginning of the book, then I'm going to jump all the way to the conclusion of the book. Is everybody still okay? Okay. This is the very opening. The trial of Jesus, whether you take it as a historical account or a literary artifact, is one of the signature narratives of Western civilization. According to John's Gospel, Jewish leaders arrest Jesus and bring him to the Roman governor of Judea, hoping Pilate will rid them of the man who proclaims himself the Son of God. Pilate, however, doesn't want to get involved in a Jewish matter. When the leaders persist, Pilate agrees to interrogate the prisoner. He asks Jesus if he is the king of the Jews. Jesus answers that his kingdom is not of this world. You are a king, then, Pilate says, to which Jesus replies, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Pilate listens to Jesus' reply, and then he asks, what is truth? It's the single most sinister question in the Bible. Pilate walks off, however, before Jesus can reply. The fact that Pilate exits, is critical. It tells us what's going on in his mind. When he asks what is truth, he's not requesting that Jesus elaborate on that other kingdom over which he claims dominion, nor is he inquiring in a philosophical way what it means to say that something is true. Rather, Pilate is dismissing the entire notion of truth. He is, in effect, rolling his eyes at the unsophisticated, even vulgar notion that truth matters in some abstract, transcendental sense. What matters from Pilate's standpoint is power. If you've got it here and now, you get to decide what's true. Pilate has the power to put Jesus to death or dismiss the charges against him. Power is Pilate's truth. It's what he knows. It's what he feels with every fiber of his being, which is the reason Friedrich Nietzsche, who had a thing for bully boys, called Pilate the solitary figure worthy of honor in the New Testament. Power is what has gotten Pilate where he is, and it's what will get him where he wants to go. Weaklings argue about the truth. Those with power grow their own. America, circa 2022, which was when the book came out, but I think we're still in this moment, is having a Pontius Pilate moment. What is truth? Whatever you will, whatever you can, whatever you dare. Truth is what you have the power to make true. If you're calling the shots, you get to decide. Everyone else can pound dirt. If truth is a function of power and power comes and goes, you can no longer say what is true objectively. You can only say what feels true subjectively, for the time being. Does the Earth revolve around the sun? Astronomical observations point in that direction, and at the moment, the powers that be stand behind those astronomical observations. But the powers that be didn't always line up behind astronomy. Ask Galileo. Plus, it sure feels like the sun is doing laps around the Earth. The proposition that the earth revolves around the sun must therefore be interrogated. Who collected those astronomical observations? Who empowered them to do so? What stake did they have in the conclusion? Doesn't a conclusion based on astronomical observations privilege a specific Enlightenment view of the Earth as an inanimate body hurtling through space, rather than as a living, nurturing mother figure, teeming with flesh and blood creatures as well as mischievous spirits and ancient gods, as many communities of color have long believed? Doesn't astronomy, in short, reinscribe the cultural hegemony of Europeans over those communities of color? That seems not only racist, but pretty damn ironic, since by the reckoning of several prominent Enlightenment thinkers, perception creates reality. Thus, the sun wouldn't even exist if it were not continuously being perceived by creatures capable of perception. But if the sun wouldn't exist without being perceived, and creatures capable of perception are found, as far as we know, only on Earth, isn't it equally true, and perhaps even more true, to say that the sun revolves around the Earth? The proposition that the Earth revolves around the sun is therefore freighted with power dynamics. It fits a dominant narrative constructed relatively recently by white male Europeans that ranks their feelings over the feelings of people of color, millions upon millions of them who lived and died convinced that the sun revolved around the Earth. They had one narrative, Europeans have another one. Right now, as you listen to these words, the European narrative is dominant. Neither narrative, however, is objectively truer than the other. And again, that is the position that I am arguing is being staked out by advocates of woke ideology. Now, let me jump all the way to the conclusion of the book. And this will take another 5 minutes and then I'll be done and I'll be anxious to hear response. This is the closing, and this concerns specifically academia. The humanities and social sciences are undergoing a reversion to an earlier model of pedagogy. Prior to the Enlightenment, most universities were sites of religious instruction. They trained clergy. Harvard was founded in 1636, a mere 6 years after the settlement of Massachusetts Bay, to ensure that future generations of New England Puritans would be served by learned ministers. That purpose is found among Harvard's original rules and precepts. And this is a quote from Harvard's original rules and precepts. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom, that is, at the base of the boat to keep it steady in the water, as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. And seeing the Lord only giveth wisdom, let everyone seriously set himself by prayer in secret to seek it of him. Once you realize that wokeism is a religion, you begin to understand that instruction in woke curricula at the university level is baptism by accreditation. It's witness and testing. You gather for 3 hours a week to dwell in the spirit, dedicate yourself to individual rituals and collective causes, to spare the fallen state of humanity, call out and cast out devils, read sacred texts and memorize venerable chants, then venture out to spread the gospel. The end is performative and sacramental. Let me tell you the many ways you are oppressed, so that you may be a river to the unwashed masses. That's the current state of humanities and social sciences in academia. It's a long-term civilizational disaster, but it's also a short-term viability crisis for higher education, because instruction in the STEM fields at American universities remains, I have to say, for the most part, traditional, focused, and globally competitive. The reversion of the humanities and social sciences in America to religious preparation cannot coexist with the ongoing excellence of STEM instruction. Something has to give. If history textbooks must be revised as a sop to self-esteem, why not biology textbooks? Pity the poor seahorse, hitherto famous as the only species in which the male gives birth. But for how long? You cannot be taught in your morning sociology seminar that the pursuit of objectivity is an instrument of white supremacist culture, which must therefore be deconstructed, and then accept that in your afternoon calculus class, the square root of 169 is objectively 13. Mustn't we interrogate the definitions of square root, 13, and 169 in order to lay bare their internal contradictions? Don't we have to inquire how the insistence that there is one and only one correct answer to the square root of 169 serves to perpetuate the many injustices of the status quo? If you think that's hyperbole, I would point you to the renowned postmodernist critic and radical feminist Lucy Irigaray. Here is a direct quote from her. Is E equal mc squared a sexed equation? Perhaps it is. Let us make the hypothesis that it is, insofar as it privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to us. What seems to me to indicate the possibly sex nature of the equation is not directly its uses by nuclear weapons, rather its having privileged what goes the fastest. If you don't know who Lucy, I'm butchering her name, Lucy Irigaray is, she is not a minor figure. She's not a marginal peripheral commentator. She is one of the most cited feminist scholars of the last half century. Okay, confronted by two irreconcilable visions of the universe, one in which reality is a social construct endlessly negotiated among discourse communities, one in which reality is a given to which we adjust our thoughts and statements, students are voting with their feet. Nationwide, the number of humanities and social science majors is mostly dropping, and the number of STEM majors is mostly rising. One disturbing exception to that trend, however, is a 5% uptick in cultural, ethnic, and gender studies majors between 2011 and 2017, which was the last year these stats were readily available, which proves to my mind that the varieties of religious experience keep multiplying, and that many students would rather hug it out than engage in the intellectual heavy lifting required to discover objective truth, though perhaps the growth in these majors is also a testament to the burgeoning field of diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs in education, business, and government. And I just, as a snide aside, whether anyone whose job title includes the words diversity, equity, or inclusion has an actual job is a topic for another book. Regardless, a disintegration is on the horizon. It's natural to think that the demand for severing ties will come from the professoriate on the STEM side, from a desire not to sully their professional reputations by sharing university affiliations with the Wokenschang described in this book. More likely, though, the demand will come from the humanities and social science side, from the unbearable adjacency of reality-based standards and scholarships to their mystical communal fiefdoms. Entrance into STEM fields requires rigorous, objective standards of assessment, as does progress in them and graduation from them. Rigorous, objective standards of assessments, however, don't produce equity. They don't produce diverse student populations. Asian students are currently overrepresented in STEM. Black students are underrepresented. Male students are overrepresented. Female students are underrepresented. According to the tenets of wokeism, demographic imbalances of that nature constitute de facto proof of racial and gender bias, since in an unbiased system, every demographic would be equally represented. How long will student activists, encouraged by humanities and social science faculty, tolerate such rank injustice on their campus? How long will the how long until the automatons invade STEM classrooms? I reiterate, something has to give. Whichever side precipitates the disintegration, it will be a necessary development. Higher education is a serious intellectual endeavor, and nothing is less intellectually serious in contemporary public life than wokeism. Empirical observation, inductive and deductive reasoning, and falsifiability are the sine qua nons of higher education. As courses of study in the humanities and social sciences depart from such things, they cease to be higher education in the post-Enlightenment sense. If it seems in these remarks that I'm too focused on the future of higher education, or that I'm attaching outsized weight to the capers of campus cut-ups, consider that the elevation of subjectivity in critical race theory, Me Too, and transgender recognition was strictly an academic curiosity before it jumped the shark and landed in your kid's 6th grade homework assignment, your company's required sensitivity training, and your city council's decision not to prosecute shoplifting. The postmodern anti-realist movements in the humanities and social sciences were running jokes among traditional scholars in the fields, right up until they weren't. Right up until free association became a standard investigative methodology, stamping your feet became a familiar form of argument, and literal nonsense became conventional wisdom. In the words of Jacques Derrida's translator and postmodernist critic Gayatri Spivak, there is no harm in the will to knowledge, for the will to ignorance plays with it to constitute it. If we long to know, we obviously long also to be duped, since knowledge is duping. Duping or bluffing, potato difference. Welcome to the humanities and social sciences, circa 2022 or 2024. It happened. It's accomplished. That genie ain't going back in the bottle. There is no logical, evidence-based argument to coax it back because the woke have been awakened to the evils of logical, evidence-based arguments. Their self-perception is transcendent. They see their teleology as liberatory rather than totalitarian. They want to remake the world into a safe space. But safe from what? Safe, I would argue, from evidence and logic. Safe from empirical observation and analysis. Safe from dispassionate inquiry. Safe from deductive reasoning. Safe from falsifiability. These are the things that hem in the woke, that prevent them from feeling what they want to feel, that leaden their imaginations. The woke, therefore, seek not only to consolidate their hegemony on American campuses, but to project that hegemony beyond humanities and social science classrooms to reconceive reality in their image. But as I've labored to show in this book, reality doesn't bend to our conceptions. Civilizations do, they collapse under them. But reality doesn't. Reality endures. With respect to the 1619 Project, history isn't altered by our feelings about what happened. With respect to Me Too, women's recollections of trauma are no more or less reliable than men's. With respect to transgender recognition, human beings in every single case are sexually classifiable as either male or female, and their acceptance or rejection of their sexual classification doesn't affect their sexual classification. That's the reality. Even ethnic and gender studies professors are ultimately answerable to reality. They've just landed gigs where they get to pretend otherwise. But reality knocks on all of our doors, regardless of our ideologies. You can bury your head under the covers, reality will slide in next to you, and it will whisper into your ear in a persistent, resonant voice that you're full of crap. There is no safe space to escape it. Remember that the purpose of a safe space is not to protect people, is to protect people's feelings and opinions, to set their feelings and opinions beyond rational debate, to render them true by virtue of being sincerely felt. Safe spaces are unreal spaces, which means safe spaces don't exist, not even, truth be told, on campus. The only support a campus can provide in the struggle to spare your feelings and opinions is a superstructure of pretense, a distribution mechanism of cotton balls to stuff in your ears. Sooner or later, however, reality will intrude. That's the truth. Yes, in the gospel sense, if you go in for that sort of thing, the truth sets you free. But in the common sense, the truth does nothing of the sort. On the contrary, it binds you. It humbles you. It challenges you to become more reasonable. How you react to the truth, of course, is a matter of conscience. You can ignore it and hope that no one notices, or you can adjust to it. But if, for the sake of people's feelings, you can be made to admit, or even worse, to believe, that what's true is false or what's false is true, then you're lost. Intellectually and morally, you're lost. That's the end of my presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldblatt, for laying out your paradoxes and also sharing with us extended passages from your book where you lay out the dilemma that we are faced with. And so just want to turn it over to Professor Bryan Russell here for response. Just a few housekeeping things as we are in the middle of this session. We have our first question already posted to the Q&A, and if any other attendees have other questions that you are curious about, feel free to drop them in there. We'll address that in our Q&A session after all of this. And with that, we'll turn it over to Bryan. Please, Bryan, take it away.
Great, thank you. So first, I want to thank Dr. Damon Johnson for the invitation and for providing me with Dr. Goldblatt's book. So I had an idea in advance of what we'd be discussing. I appreciate that. And Dr. Goldblatt for presumably agreeing to my inclusion in this discussion. For those who don't know me, again, I'm a professor in the philosophy department here, and I coach our Bakersfield College Ethics Bowl team, in which we discuss topical ethical dilemmas, some of which touch on sensitive issues like this. So that's why I'm here, because this is what we do in Ethics Bowl. This is what we're doing here, right? So just to show that I was paying attention to the presentation, and this isn't completely based on my reading of the book, I did want to answer the paradoxes that you suggested in your or that Dr. Goldblatt suggested in his opening. So first paradox one, that when it comes to transgender issues, we're not debating science. Gender identity is personal. So I agree to that we're debating. I think I'm capturing that what we're debating here is a matter of definition, not of the scientific facts, right? With regard to paradox two, that if somebody makes the claim despite appearances, I am a woman, can the sincerity effect with which somebody states a claim affect the truth value of the claim? I'm sort of shocking myself and arguing yes for this with regard to the identification as a woman or a man, and with an analogy that I'm going to make to that later in the discussion. Paradox three, are identical, the statement identical twins are the same, always the same sex, correct or not? I'm going to argue, my position will entail that I argue you should correct this. And paradox four, that only females can give birth, I'm going to argue that does need to be corrected. But before I get specifically into the issue of transgender recognition, I'm going to start by talking about so your argument in general and two different conclusions you might be driving at with your argument. And in your response, if you'd be so kind as to tell me which of those that you are driving at, it would help me. So your argument, so advocates of critical race theory, Me Too, and transgender recognition share a devotion to subjectivism. Their gathering principle is the idea that subjective belief, if heartfelt, trumps whatever objective and verifiable evidence may be brought against it. For these social justice warriors, if you sincerely and passionately believe an injustice is being done, then the effort to determine whether that belief corresponds with the reality is a further injustice. So let me lay out what I take to be the conclusions of the woke movement with regard to the areas that you address in the book. So for critical race theory, that systematic racism is operative in the US still. For Me Too, that we should generally believe women who say they are victims of sexual assault, and for trans recognition, that transgender people should be identified in many contexts by their gender instead of their sex. And we can have a discussion about whether I fairly presented those conclusions or not. So with regard to those conclusions of the woke movement, I take your argument to be driving at one of two claims. The first would be that the woke movement is an error to the extent that it relies on a rejection of objective truth, but it need not. So they could get to many of the same conclusions that they come to by looking at objective evidence and putting the subjectivism to the side, right? Or conclusion two, which is the one I take you to be driving at least at some points in the book. There's no way to get to the main conclusions of the woke movement without relying on subjectivism. So if the conclusion is one, then I take what you're saying to be sort of a helpful corrective for the woke movement. You could find many areas of agreement between the woke movement's conclusions and some things you say in the book yourself, things like race is a social construct, and there are many others. Reading through the book, I was surprised to see how many areas of agreement there might be. But on this reading, it's a nice corrective for the woke movement. On the second reading, then I'm going to argue that, so the second reading being there's no way to get to the conclusions without relying on subjectivism. Then I'll argue that you've jumped the gun on drawing conclusions from science about which the jury is still out. As I will argue is the case with, in the text, your reliance on the Fryer study to prove that there's no systemic racism in policing. And I'm going to argue for the conclusion that you're in error saying that advocates of trans recognition are rejecting objective truth. All right, so with regard to critical race theory, so I say that the disparities that we talked about and that some studies show do not prove racism, but that the conjunction of the disparities in race in arrest rates, killings, math PhDs, test scores, etc., along with this country's history of slavery and racist policies like redlining, law enforcement, and murders, should make the unbiased thinker think, or social scientists suspect, so strongly suspect even, that racism is still at work in many areas of life. In other words, the burden of proof seems to fall squarely on those who claim that systemic racism is not effective in America. But I think we're in agreement that hypotheses require testing, and I agree that people shouldn't shy away from investigating the studies. So in your argument to show that the George Floyd killing had nothing to do with racism, you use the Fryer study as a premise for your argument. So trying to establish that that killing does not fit a well-established pattern of police violence against Black people. So I wanted to look a little bit closer at that Fryer study before I get to the trans issue, and hopefully I'll have time for both. So the Fryer study, for those not familiar, so Fryer, a sociologist from Harvard, he controlled for the number of times police encountered suspects of various races and found that when you do that, police do not kill Black folks at a higher rate than they kill white folks, right? So the ratio of encounters to killings is not higher, even though the total number of killings might be higher when it comes to Black folks killed to white folks killed, because the ratio is the same, right? So there's been a whole bunch of scholarly debate about Freier's methods. There's been particular attention paid to his sampling method. So to summarize some of this, when comparing treatment of comparable groups, you need to make sure that the groups are comparable for the comparison to tell you much of anything. So the groups in the Freier study are white people encountered by police and Black people encountered by police. So on the face of it, these seem like comparable groups, the only difference being the race of the people pulled over, right? But there's lots of evidence to suggest that police are encountering Black folks more than white folks. So take, for example, the famous study of the stop and frisk policy in New York. It showed, and I quote here, most stops occur in Black and Latino neighborhoods, and even after adjustments for other factors, including crime rates, social conditions, and allocation of police resources in those neighborhoods, race is the main factor in determining NYPD stops. So let me conjoin the results of these studies to show why the Freier study might be a little bit problematic. If the same thing is happening in Freier's data, say that police are pulling over Black folks much more often and on the grounds of maybe not as much evidence, then we can presume that police are encountering many more unthreatening, not dangerous Black folks, while white folks are being pulled over and encountered because there's serious evidence of a crime. So this is a difference in the two populations, right? One population is people being pulled over, say, without much evidence for them committing any crime. And one is being, and that would be the Black population. And then one is being pulled over with really strong evidence that they're committing a crime, right? So that makes for two different populations despite their surface similarity. So the difference in populations can skew the data. Imagine, so here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine you're an officer who pulls over every Black person you see, and you see 100 per this day. But you only pull over white people if you see they're in the midst of committing a serious crime, and you witness this 10 times in a day to make the numbers easy. Imagine further, you end up killing 2 Black people and 1 white person. Freier's methods would show you that you kill 2% of the Black folks you encounter and 10% of the white folks you encounter, which would seem that you're being racist against white people based on his method. But really what was happening is your racism in the pullover rate was lowering the rate of the rate that you kill Black folks compared to white folks. I hope that was sort of clear. This criticism Freier himself concedes. So when asked about this, he says, when we analyze only cases in which the officer involved shooting began with a routine stop or traffic stop, we do not find bias. But these results are suspect to the point that there's more traffic stops of Blacks. So I want to say a little bit more than he said. I want to say that the results, I want to say, along with the people investigating this, that the police stopping Black folks more often means that Freier has compared 2 essentially different populations. And if we correct for that, then this bias in killing does show up. And we can have a good discussion about whether I'm unfairly shifting the goalposts or something like that. But that's my argument about critical race theory, that the science, that we can still get to the claims of critical race theorists, at least in regard to bias in policing, while respecting the science, while digging into the science on the issue, right? And that might be something which you're willing to concede, depending on how you answer my first issue. So when it comes to trans recognition, So there's a lot of there's common ground in our positions here. So insofar as trans folks are people, they deserve rights and respect. They should, and interestingly, they should also be allowed accommodations for using restrooms. That was a nice point of agreement that I found. I think it was in your book, or to be completely transparent, I listened to your interview with on YouTube that got taken down. I found the source for it with my Google Food, but that's why I'm not sure which it came from. But so I'm going to argue further. So I'm going to try to press on this point a little bit that transgender people deserve to be called the gender with which they identify. And I'm going to provide some considerations which lead me to believe that we should welcome the drift in meanings of the terms man and woman. So first, I want to note that there's precedent for changing the definitions of words when it serves the purposes of society as it evolves. We changed the definition of death, for example. It was already contentious, with some people arguing that it should be applied when someone's heart stops, and other people arguing that it should be applied when somebody's brain stopped functioning, with the former definition, the heart stopping, being predominant. But then the technology of heart transplants arrived, and we needed to change the definition from the heart stopping to the brain ceasing to function. And why did we do that? So heart surgeons wouldn't be tried for murder, right? So the second piece of this argument, so the first is that there's precedent for changing the definition of terms to suit societal ends. The second point I'll present here is I'll try to construct a refutation by logical analogy. So in other words, I'll try to make an argument that has the same structure as yours, but that argument that I'm going to present doesn't work, so it should lead us to believe that your argument on trans issues doesn't work. So the analogy that I'm going to make is that of adopted parents or adopted siblings. So this analogy is adapted for my purposes from one proposed by Sophie Grace Chappell. I want to give credit to her, but I'm going to shift it a little bit for my purposes. So there's some similarities. First, there are biological definitions of terms like parent and sister, just like there are with sex in the trans discussion. But in practice, adopted children will call their adopted parents their father and mother, and their siblings brother and sister. Just like in the analogy is to the trans people saying they're, the gender with which they identify. Now, one could say, just like you do for the trans issue, that the facts are in and they're plain as day. Also, just like the trans issue, so the facts are in, you can look at biology. Biology has these definitions of what it means to be a parent, what it means to be, the offspring of those parents, etc. And also, just like the trans issue, this could generate sensationalist headlines like daughter with no family, history of cancer, develops cancer at the same age her mother did. I have some other examples, but I'll skip them for time. Similarly, one might read page 122 of your book by substituting the adopted language for the trans issue. So here you say, regardless of where you come down on the question, at least recognize what's going on. And now I'm misreading. When you say trans gendered people, I'm going to substitute adopted people. And where you say gender identity, I'm going to substitute family feeling. So adopted people claim the right to substitute their family feeling for their biological classification as a family member. That claim is their beginning and end, their will to power. Family feeling must, upon demand, override biological classification. Subjective, unverifiable belief must override objective, verifiable reality. That claim is not debatable according to adoption activists. To question it is a little act of violence against the adopted. But of course, the claim is debatable. Family feeling and sexual classification, family feeling and family classification are, I repeat, different things. The former is mysterious and untestable, the feeling that somebody's their mother, their adopted mother is their mother, right? And the latter is empirical, like imagine a test of the genome test or something like this to see if somebody's their real father, Maury, right? And therefore they are by no means interchangeable. Acknowledging that reality denies the existence of no one, it must hold that adopted people are not what they believe themselves to be. Adopted people are delusional people. Delusional people exist, they always have, and there's no reason to suspect they will cease to exist in the future. They deserve our sympathy and respect, and their natural rights are the same as everyone's, but no one, including an adopted person, has a natural right to force his delusions on others. So by this analogy, I would have no right to force on somebody else that they call my brother. So full disclosure, I am adopted. So my brother, and my mother, right? I have no right to impose that upon them. I cannot compel others to disregard that which is testably true in favor of that which cannot be tested. I cannot compel them to play along, to act as characters in my fictional narrative to pretend, right? So my claim here is the second argument, the argument about adoption. It doesn't go through. I think as an adopted person, I do have a right to certainly to call my mother and father my mother and father, my brother and sister my brother and sister, and to be justifiably upset if other people say reality is going to smack you in the face, that you're not justified, and I don't need to call your mother, etc. All right, so then the last point I'll make, and sorry, how much over am I? Okay.
Don't worry about it. If you have one more point to make,
feel free. Just one more. So the last thing I want to say is nothing about adopted kids or trans recognition breaks our language or logic. And apologies for this. It gets a little bit snarky. I'll try to soften that a little bit. So we have words and rules of logic to accommodate the nuance of broad terms like brother or man. We use the words unless or. And a logical rule which can translate unless statements to everybody's favorite if then statements, material implications. So for example, somebody could say a human man cannot give birth to a child. And if we want to accommodate trans folks, we'll have to add an unless, right? A human man cannot give birth to a child unless that man is a trans man, right? And the analogous claim for the adopted person would be brothers are not the offspring of different parents unless one or more have been adopted. And then we can shift that with material implication to an if then, and our statements would read, if a human man can give birth to a child, then that man is a trans man. Makes sense? If brothers are the offspring of different parents, then one or more have been adopted, or some other method of becoming family. There are many ways of becoming family members, just like I'm claiming there are multiple ways of being a man or a woman, right? All right, so to sum up, do you see yourself supporting the more conservative thesis that to the extent that woke movements rely on subjectivism to justify their conclusions, they're in error, but they need not rely on subjectivism to justify their conclusions, so a nice corrective view, or the stronger thesis that the only way to justify the main claims of woke movements is by relying on subjectivism. So if it's the former, I say it's a nice corrective to the woke movements. If it's the latter, then I think then we have more disagreements to hash out, right? Second, the transgender issue seems like a terminological dispute. It seems to me that neither side is rejecting the correspondence theory of truth. One side's claiming that the terms man and woman correspond to biological facts, just like somebody might do with an adopted parent or a parenting, right? Or also by extension, brother and sister. The other side is claiming that the terms correspond to facts about gender. So there's something about the world that these correspond to. I don't see that it's a rejection of the correspondence theory of truth. It's likely that the former use was predominant, that people used to say man and woman, and they meant the biological But words change to accommodate societal uses and goals. Take, for example, the way we changed the definition of death. Further, the extension and intension of analogous words like father and sister have changed, and the updated meanings have been easily accommodated by our logic and language. That's my presentation. Thank you for allowing me however much extra time, sweet Jesus, that took.
Well, we thank you for all your comments. And Dr. Goldblatt, if you have anything that you would like to respond to, feel free to go ahead. And then after you're done, after you're finished, we'll then open it up to the Q&A.
Okay, I think I just unmuted myself again. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Yeah, there are a bunch of things. I think I do tend towards the second more I don't want to say radical because it's more reactionary position than the first. But I did hear a number of places where we agree, and significant places where we agree. So, for example, on the issue of private acts, which I think you have to distinguish from public policy, if a student presents as female in the class, in a class that I'm teaching, and I know because I'm looking at a roster that the student was born male and is presenting female, I'm not going to call out that student in front of other students or to her face. I'm going to use whatever pronoun she prefers, but I'm doing that as a private courtesy. If you ask me what is the truth of that situation, the answer is still going to be that that person is a biological man, a genomic man, and presenting as a woman. And I think to go back to, I'm trying to do this in reverse order, which is given my, I'm on new medications for an enlarged prostate. So it's like whirling around in my head right now. If, to go back to what you said at the very end, we can make an adjustment in the language to say that only women give birth unless it's a trans man. The problem is that, number one, I don't think that will be an acceptable compromise to most transgender advocates that I know, because it's a concession that trans man and man are not the same thing. You see it on posters all the time. A trans man is a man, a trans woman is a woman. What you're conceding with that example is that trans man is a woman. And I would argue that for that reason, there is no just cause to revise the definition of who can give birth. In other words, if you have to say that men with an asterisk can give birth, I don't think that solution would be acceptable to either side, because you're conceding in that example that a trans man is a woman, or else you're just erasing the binary between man and woman. And if you're erasing the binary between man and woman, you're going to run into the teeth of that syllogism. And I think that, again, I certainly don't want to speak for trans activists or advocates, because I'm not their favorite person, and I don't think they would want me to. But I do think that they are sincere in their belief that they are precisely what they claim to be. And the evidence for that is their, in the case of trans women, their demand to compete in sports against women. If they did not believe that they were literally women or literally girls at younger levels, then that demand would be nonsensical. It would be a non-starter. I don't think they think of themselves as asterisked. I think they think of themselves as what they claim to be. And I think that in arguing against that position, I'm trying to respect the position that they are actually advocating. As for the Fryer study, yeah, so I'm sorry if I'm jumping around. The Fryer study was criticized mostly because it didn't take into account the higher rate of contact between the police and black suspects versus the police and white suspects. I like your turn on that, that it may be that they're encountering a rougher group of white subjects than they are black subjects. The stop and frisk laws are based on something called a Terry stop, which is the right of the police to stop someone from the activity that they are engaged in and ask them questions before they've committed an actual crime. So the standard example of that is if you're a cop and you see a guy walking up the street trying the car doors of all the cars parked on the street, he's trying to get in. Technically, he hasn't broken a law, but he's acting in a way that indicates he will soon be breaking a law. And under the Terry stop precedent, the police are allowed to pull him over and question him. I take your point that the police, when they go into lower crime neighborhoods, are generally dealing with crimes that are in progress. And thus, they may have, the people who are committing the crimes may have more reason to resist than the people who are just being stopped on the basis of a Terry stop. But the other part of the Fryer study is problematic for that interpretation, because Fryer also found that the police were more likely to rough up a black subject than a white subject. And you would think if the white subjects were more often actively engaged in a crime and were more belligerent than the black subjects, then they would be at least equally likely to be roughed up by the police. What makes the Fryer study so surprising is that in order to conclude that the police are acting in an actively racist way, you have to conclude that they are racist in the roughing up process, but somehow the racism disappears at the moment of the shooting. And I just find that difficult to sort of wrestle with in my mind. I concede in the book, and I have aggravated many of my conservative readers and friends with this concession, that the legacy of institutional racism, of systemic racism, is still with us. I do argue that it's a legacy, but the fact is, coming out of slavery, coming out of Jim Crow, coming out of legal segregation, coming out of wealth gaps, coming out of all of the difficulties that historically marginalized communities face, that dominant communities don't face, that you have the reality that many of the children in those communities are simply born behind an 8 ball. They are raised in households where, in the case of Black children, more than 50% are raised in single parent households. I think it's 74% are products of birth, are born to single mothers. But I think the being born to single mother and being raised in a single parent household are two different measures. And the unmarried mother problem is not a problem in the same way as the single parenthood one is. And you can skew the data by sampling error that way. But the more critically, though, if you reframe the problem of, say, police contact in a slightly different way, you wind up with conclusions that you clearly don't want. So, for example, the police grotesquely disproportionately stop male suspects as compared to female suspects. It would strain credibility to argue that the police are therefore biased against men. The fact is that women commit a fraction of the crime that men do, and therefore you're going to have far more encounters between police and male suspects than you will between police and female suspects. I don't think you can deduce anything about the police motivation or about the bias of police from the fact that there's a simple numerical disparity on that level. And frankly, the fact that the police have a much more visible presence in high crime neighborhoods is logical. That's where we want the police. And it's precisely to protect the residents of those neighborhoods who are also Black. It's not a coincidence that when I think they were called the Rockefeller drug laws, were put into effect in the 1980s and 1990s, the bills that enacted those laws, that became those laws, were sponsored in part by members of the Congressional Black Caucus, because the Black neighborhoods were becoming killing fields, and they said, whatever it takes, we just want non-criminals in Black neighborhoods to be able to live peaceful lives. And the non-criminals are the overwhelming majority in those neighborhoods. Unfortunately, and this is one of the significant tragedies of our age, Black men are victims of violent homicides at a rate of something like 46 for every 100,000 people. White men in the same age cohorts are something like a tenth as likely to be victims of violent homicides. Once you go to women, the numbers drop off even more. What makes it especially tragic, aside from the victimization, is that the victimizers are grotesquely disproportionately Black men also. And that sets us up with a really grotesque choice, a really bad choice that we have to make. We are in a position of either seeing more Black male faces behind bars or Black male faces in the morgue. And given that choice, I'm going to take the more Black faces behind bars. I mean,
a tough choice it is.
Yeah.
And I think, and unfortunately, to close that on a somewhat discouraging note,
yeah.
It is one of the dilemmas that arises and has to be dealt with in how do we understand and know things. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. So
Okay, I'm
uh,
sorry if I went on.
it's all right. I know that this is one of the hazards of talking to philosophers. They will
Yeah,
talk.
I set a bad precedent.
No, no, you were great. Matter of fact, I can't tell you how flattered I was listening to you because that was a close reading of my book.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you.
Mhm. Now, now just be careful about how much philosophers will talk if you get a little bit of wine in them. But we already know that answer. Plato's Symposium tells that story. Um, so we have a couple of questions in here. I'm going to try to keep it even-handed. Um, so I think we'll start out here with a question from one of our guests. This one is directed for both of you. Um, and I think it goes to the definition of woke and wokeism. I think all of us have heard that term, used that term. So how would we talk about it in a way that we can make sense of it?
Should I should I go? Because
Please.
this was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the only reason I'm jumping on this one is I already know what I'm going to say
Yeah,
because
I
it
have
was
no
one
idea.
of the
Yeah, I'll take
um,
take this
when
one.
I first went out on the book tour, there was a conservative author. I forgot what her name is, and it just shoots out of my head all the time. Who was out promoting her book on wokeism, and she was asked to define woke, and it just baffled her. She couldn't come up with a definition. So before I started to do interviews, I wanted to have a clear definition of it in my mind. And I wanted to also have a generous definition of it in my mind. And I think in the most generous terms I can convey, wokeism is a cluster of advocacy positions that promote a sensitivity toward and an understanding of historically marginalized people. And I think on that level, it is impossible to object to it. Historically marginalized people should be welcomed into the larger public conversation that has been going on since the founding of the Republic. Matter of fact, the res publica, I would argue, is a conversation. It's the public thing that we are all engaged in. The problem with wokeism is the methodology by which that advocacy proceeds. And that's where I think you get the subjectivity. The woke attempt to redress historical grievances, and the historical grievances are real. The woke attempt to address them proposes that subjective feelings are as valid a methodology towards truth as objective empirical evidence. And that's where I think they run into difficulties. And, with the obvious example is the 1619 project, which, falls under the umbrella of the critical race theory, which posits that, most famously, that the American Revolution was fought substantially in order to preserve slavery in the colonies. That claim has been annihilated by historians on the left, the right, and the center. It won't work unless you propose that the objective measures by which historians go about saying this happened are unfair or don't take into account my feelings. And my feelings, because I'm a member of a historically marginalized community, carry a kind of mystical insight which lets me transcend the evidence to get to the truth. I'm sorry, I was rambling, but
That was great. The only thing that I would add is I guess it would be my position on this that um, well, first I'll concede that when I was looking for big gotcha quotes about folks in your book relying on objective evidence. Sometimes I'd run into them using subjective evidence to make their case, and um, and to that extent, I was sometimes disappointed. I was thinking, oh, like maybe this could be your book could be a nice corrective about these movements trying to get to their goals of representing these historically marginalized people um, uh, without such reliance on first person accounts, or at least taking those just as a starting point, right? So we take people's, if I wanted to figure out what a war, what soldiers were treated like in war, my first instinct would be, well, I'll ask a soldier about how they were, what their experience in war was like. Now, if I was really interested in the question, that would be my jumping off point, and I would take their point of view as sort of just like a prior view, like a given view, and now I need to investigate it with looking at the studies. Yeah, I'm not sure how to tie this up, but
I will say that it's a short book, and that was at my publisher's behest. So.
yeah.
All right. Thank you for your responses to that question to both of you. Given the time, I am going to leave it for two more questions. One question that has been asked by a couple of people, and then that one's going to be directed to you, Professor Russell. And then as the host, I'm going to reserve my privilege to ask the last question. And that's actually a question I'm going to reserve for you, Professor Goldblatt, since it's, I think I think it's going to poke at something that straddles let's say it straddles ontological boundaries. So we'll see about where that goes. So for you, Professor Russell, one of the questions that has come up from some of the folks who have been messaging here is regarding your category of adoption and making it equivalent to transgenderism. The objection comes in a couple of forms. One form takes it as adoption is a legal definition, and without that legal definition, a person who has feelings, family feelings, without that actual signed piece of paper, that doesn't constitute them as being adopted. And then a second way of framing the question is that I'll quote it here, that adoption is not claiming or leading to an ontological change in the child's physiology, whereas a person seeking to transition is redefining their physiology based on their self-expression. Furthermore, adoption happens to the child rather than the child self-determining their adoptive family. So I think I can frame the category question as this. Adoption is not in the will of the child being adopted. Whereas in transgenderism, it is the will of the person who's transitioning that is spurring the change.
Yeah, and those are both really good questions. When I was preparing that logical refutation, I found some criticism of the analogy also. So when we're making analogies between things, ideally they share a ton of similarities and they share very few dissimilarities. And the more that's the case, the stronger our analogies are. In Dr. Goldblatt's book, there's an analogy between a transgender advocate, or sorry, a trans person and a schizophrenic, somebody who believes something that is just not the case, right? So in both cases, I want to concede that the analogies are not perfect. And along with that, the recognition that that's why this issue is so contentious, that our analogies are sort of are not perfect fits with this, so we make them as close as we can. With regard to the adopted person not self-determining who their parents are, because the parents adopt them, and now it's a legal definition of them being an adopted child. There's a lot of weirdness in being an adopted child with family relationships. So I don't want this to sound like I'm making this about me, but or that my experience somehow makes this whole case, and objections to me are not appropriate. So I was raised with two brothers and sisters after being adopted when I was very little, and I called them my brother and sister. I later met my my biological mom and my biological father, each who uh, have kids of their own, and I've taken to calling them brother and sister. And I want to say that even if I don't make the qualification that, oh, that's my half bio sister, or that's my half bio brother, um, that to make this analogy fit more, it would have to be the case that what I say about that is what other people should say about that. And that's maybe a contentious claim, but I'm saying the similarity there is my feeling about our relationship there is is something that can make it the case that they are that, and that other people should recognize it. And I mean, these are both really good questions. The legal definition is one that I would consider, I would have to consider more, but that's the analogy I was trying to make.
All right. Thank you, Professor Russell, for that response. And Dr. Goldblatt, here I have two possible questions that I kind of want to ask you, but I'll leave it to you which one you want to answer.
I want to answer the easy one.
All right. One question, I'll tell you what the questions are about first, and then I'll let you choose. One question is based on a C.S. Lewis quote I've been ruminating on lately. And then the other question regards myth. Which one sounds more interesting?
I do admire C.S. Lewis, so let's go with that.
All right.
Myth has more chance of me spitting at the screen. I'm talking.
Fair enough.
PH at the end.
All right, so I'll go with this C.S. Lewis quote. This is a quotation taken from his publicated selected literary essays, particularly his essay entitled Bluespels and Falalanceres, which is an interesting title. But here's the quote I've been ruminating on. Reason is the natural organ of understanding, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Now, to break that down for those folks who are not familiar, Lewis is drawing on medieval categories of intellect. And you have ratio versus imagination. So the question to you, Professor Goldblatt, what do you make of that quote? And how does it fit into correspondence theory?
Well, correspondence theory is the application of reason to what you believe. But I would imagine imagination is the generator of what you believe. The idea would be you look at reality and you imagine theories to explain reality. The way in which you determine the truth value of your theories is through reason comparing what your belief is to reality itself. And you're working towards that correspondence. And all truth, well, I shouldn't say all truth, all knowledge that is generated through inductive logic, through empirical evidence and drawing conclusions on the basis of it, is contingent. It's tentative. You're always out there waiting for some other set of data, some other aspect of reality to overturn what you believed that you knew, and to force you to come up with a new hypothesis to explain what you now observe. with the way I would connect the two is that without imagination, reason has no starting point. And without reason, imagination has no process, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. And I think you've done C.S. Lewis proud with that analysis. And I think with that, it is past 7:30. So to be considerate of
It's way past 7:30 in New York.
exactly, since Professor Goldblatt is coming to us from New York, we'll be considerate of his time and also his sleep. But thank you all for joining us for this conversation.
And
And I
thank you
hope you
for
were
having me.
edified by this.
And thank you again for reading my book and responding. So that
Right.
I have to say I've enjoyed this probably more than any other one because I've never had a respondent in any of these talks. And I've always been interviewed by people who tended to agree with me. This was refreshing. This was nice. I liked it.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. I really appreciated your engagement with my points. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. And again, that book is I Feel, Therefore I Am, The Triumph of Woke Subjectivism. But if you're curious for fictional reading from Professor Goldblatt, do take a look at his book. What was it again? I wrote the title down here.
Might as well be dead, but
Might
there's
as well be
another one
dead.
called My Life is a Dixie Doll. Just go to markgoldblatt.com. Everything's for sale up there.
All right. Thank you very much. And with that,
Thank you.
we'll
Bye-bye.
close out
Thanks
the
for having me.
evening. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.